pretty looking hand, but it's important to note that while it's a pretty hand, it's a pretty drawing hand. When it's suited, it's the best drawing hand you can have. It's a drawing hand because it doesn't beat a lowly pair of deuces without improving. Often, if no ace or king hits on the flop, you'll be forced to dump your hand. Probably one of the biggest mistakes amateurs make when playing ace-king is continuing to chase after the flop even when they don't hit a pair. There are times when it would be correct to do so, but more often than not, if you don't catch a piece of the flop, you shouldn't invest another penny. When deciding when to continue with an unimproved ace-king, there are several factors to consider. First, consider the number of opponents. The more players there are in any particular pot, the more likely that your unimproved ace-king is behind. In fact, you could easily be drawing dead. For example, let's say you raise with ace-king and 4 other players called you. If the flop comes, say, 9, 6, 7, you shouldn't even consider putting another chip in the pot. It's highly likely that one of your opponents has at least a pair, and they could even have a set or a straight, which would mean that even if you caught an ace and a king, you'd still lose the pot. Don't even bluff at this flop. A saved bet is just as good as a bet earned. Next is position. If you don't hit the flop with ace-king and your opponent has position on you, I'm afraid you're just going to have to respect the power position and proceed like a little girl, if you will. If your opponent bets at you, while he might be bluffing, you just don't have a strong enough hand to justify calling him. Besides, if you don't catch an ace or a king on the turn, are you really going to just call his bets all the way to the river? That's just not good poker. However, if you are the player in position with an unimproved ace-king, then you should consider calling on the flop, whether you miss or not. By calling on the flop, you may freeze your opponent, which may allow you to pick up the pot on the turn with a bet. Again, whether you improve on the turn is irrelevant, as in this case, you'll be playing your opponent, not the cards. How about added outs? Sometimes you'll miss your ace-king by not making a pair, but might have other added outs, like a straight or a flush draw. In this case, if the bet is small enough, it might be worth calling to see one more card, especially since you'll usually be drawing to the nuts. A 4 flush with ace-king on the flop is actually a powerful hand that should be played aggressively, while a gut-shot straight draw on a flop like queen 10-4 should be played more cautiously, hoping to spike that miracle jack on the turn. Next, size up the type of opponent you're dealing with. Understanding your opponents, as in the case with all things poker, will help you make a better guess as to when to continue. For example, if your opponent is just a mad bluffer, you may be more inclined to look him up. Or if you know your opponent is a tight player who plays high cards and the flop comes queen 9-8, you shouldn't even think about calling a bet. Finally, look at the board texture. Once you're able to put your opponent on a range of hands, you should also be able to have a better feel for what flops will miss them, which are also good flops for your ace-king. For example, say you raise before the flop, a tightish player calls you. If the flop comes deuce-deuce-4, you can rest assured that your opponent doesn't have any piece of that board. In this case, you should actually bet your ace-king to protect your hand. At the same time, you're representing a big pair. If your opponent doesn't have a pair, or even if he has a small pair, he might even fold right on the flop.